Hi, my name is Seth Lazar. I'm a professor of philosophy at the ANU. I'm going to be presenting my paper on the site of predictive justice, which I wrote with Jake Stone, also at the ANU. So we've only got about 8 minutes, so I'm going to treat this as basically an opportunity to make a kind of advertisement for the paper, rather than give you the full details. But let's start out with a fairly caricatured portrayal of two different camps within the literature on algorithmic fairness. On the one hand, you've got maximalists. On the other hand, you've got minimalists. So the maximalists basically take the view that we should forget about these abstract and highly idealized criteria of algorithmic fairness. We should instead aim to build just societies, not just algorithms. And the minimalists say that we should, broadly speaking, leave social costs to policymakers, focus on model performance, evaluate models against epistemic standards, not against moral standards, evaluate the decisions against moral standards for sure, but the models themselves, the predictions, should be evaluated against only epistemic standards. We think that this is a mistake. There is a middle path between these two extremes. Predictive models should be subjected not only to epistemic standards, but also to moral ones, to standards that we call of predictive justice. These are distinct from standards of outcome or procedural justice. And these standards, these norms, don't have to be abstract and idealized. They can be situated and contextual. They can appeal to structural injustice. They can be grounded in concerns about structural injustice. But they also don't involve kind of overreach on the part of ML engineers, developers, researchers, engaging in this kind of technocratic incursion into areas that are the proper kind of decision-making authority, or within the proper decision-making authority of democratic polities. Okay, so let's start with a couple of quick definitions before we get into the meat of the argument. We're talking about predictions and decisions. So predictions are just inference from past experience to out-of-sample cases. Decisions are what you do with your predictive model, how you use it to change the world. We're not interested only in machine learning. We think that these standards of predictive justice apply to all predictive models, whether they use ML or not. Generally, people think that moral norms constrain decisions, while epistemic norms constrain our epistemic practices, so moral norms like, the categorical imperative, or epistemic norms like the Kolmogorov probability axioms. We argue that predictive models are also constrained by moral norms of predictive justice. They're moral norms that target our epistemic practices, and that these are explanatorily distinct from the norms concerning the outcomes that from the decisions that we use these models to bring about, or the procedures that these models contribute to, the decision procedures they contribute to. There is interesting work in philosophy on what we call epistemic ethics, the sort of broader theory of how moral norms constrain epistemic practices, and we fit what we're doing here within that broader tradition. So the way the paper proceeds is that we offer a principle of predictive justice. It's just a necessary condition for a model being predictively just. It's not a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. The principle is very simple. It's a prioritarian performance principle that says a model is predictively just only if its performance for systematically disadvantaged groups cannot be improved without a disproportionate decline in its performance for systematically advantaged groups. Very, very simply put, all this says is that you should put more weight in evaluating model performance on its performance for disadvantaged groups. Very simple and intuitive principle. It is only a necessary condition. We don't give a full account of what makes a group disadvantaged, although we appeal to a broader background theory that we draw from Iris, Marrow, and Young to account for that. The underlying motivation for this principle is the recognition of background structural injustice. So the fact that predictive and other representational practices in structurally unjust societies are both caused by that background injustice and help sustain it. So the way in which representations routinely center the experiences of advantaged populations as normal and optimize for that normal setting contributes to the ongoing disadvantage of the disadvantaged group. And we have reasons not to use models that kind of reflect that, not to endorse it, not to contribute to it going forward, not to tolerate it in our practices. This is what grounds this underlying reason that we have to care more about model performance for disadvantaged groups. So there are backwards-looking remedial grounds here in terms of responding to that background of injustice, and there are also forward-looking grounds to not contribute or participate in the cultural schemas that sustain background injustice. In the paper, what we do next is we talk about the kind of degrees and kinds of predictive justice or predictive injustice. We really focus here in particular on the kind of the reasons why the model performs worse for the disadvantaged and the advantaged group. In situations where it's down to some kind of causal factor that is kind of morally innocent, that isn't caused by the background structural injustice, isn't the responsibility of the people developing the model, then we think that the grounds for prioritizing the interests of the disadvantaged group are proportionately reduced. No, they still should be prioritized over those of the advantaged group, but to a lesser degree than in the alternative setting where the reason for the model's underperformance has to do with how it was been trained on the socially unjust past. So these are situations where background structural injustice kind of infects the model and makes it more predictably unjust to use it. We also talk about ways in which the social power of the institution that endorses the model affects the degree of injustice occasioned by actually that endorsement. We think that's really important, and that we can distinguish between like how unjust the model is and how unjust it is to endorse the model. And in the latter case, that's partly a function of the degree of social power of that the institution doing the endorsement. Okay, so it's pretty clear that this this principle it's a principle of algorithmic fairness. It targets model performance. It talks about how to evaluate model performance, but it's very much situated. It refers to background injustice, the nature of these advantaged, disadvantaged groups. It is motivated and grounded in the desire to remedy and respond to and not participate in structural injustice. So that's why we call this a situated principle of justice, and we contrast it with what we call cosmic principles of justice, where cosmic principles of justice basically try and determine whether a model or anything else is just or unjust in virtue solely of its intrinsic properties. So, without reference to the nature of the society where it's being deployed or the groups that it's being deployed to. That cosmic approach really has been common in approaches to algorithmic fairness. We contrast our approach with one of Brian Hedden, a colleague of ours at ANU, who develops a cosmic principle of predictive justice. And we show how, as you move from the kind of highly idealized setting that he considers to a more concrete, realistic setting, the sorts of cosmic principles that he considers have less and less purchase, and the kinds of situated principle that we advance has more purchase. Now, just to wrap things up, and again, please do read the paper. It's at mintresearch.org/pj if you want to get the full details. Just want to say that, predictive justice obviously isn't the most important thing in the world. Like, outcome justice, procedural justice matter more. Decisions generally matter more, especially when you're making significant difference in the world, than the nature of your predictions. That's a given. But it's also really important to keep this site of predictive justice separate from the evaluation of outcomes and procedures. Part of this is just due to the fact that when you make a decision, you want to justify it in part by appealing to the model that grounded the prediction that supports the decision. But if the model, the performance of the model is grounded in itself in facts about the decisions to which it's subsequently going to be used to reach, then you've got this circularity. You're justifying the decision in terms of the model, but then the model in terms of the decision that enables you to reach. That's a problem. It's also really important, I think, to identify different sites of justice in order to be able to distinguish between different things that you might want to disagree about. So you can bracket some things and focus on others. So we might say, okay, look, we're going to focus on what the moral criteria are for evaluating the predictive model. We might be able to agree on those, but not be able to agree on questions about the outcomes and the procedures that it will lead to, the decisions it will lead to. Keeping these separate enables us to sort of identify agreement where we can. And the downside of going the other way is that you end up with predictive models that are kind of entirely imbued with not just sort of values to the degree that it's unavoidable that they will be, but with everything about your whole kind of political perspective. That's going to be problematic. And lastly, this leads to the point I alluded to at the beginning. We need to be careful about the attempt to use this particular point of intervention to achieve broader social goals beyond just kind of what we've been talking about here, predictive justice. We need to really kind of highlight where and when that's appropriate and inappropriate, because sometimes what it involves is basically ML engineers taking on this kind of technocratic authority to change things that should really be the proper province of democratic decision makers. So there is some reason for that minimalist view to say, look, some things ought not be the responsibility of the engineers, not because they aren't morally responsible, morally accountable. They are. They should at least pay attention to predictive justice, but more because there are some things that they don't have the proper authority, some decisions they don't have the authority to make. So outcome and procedural justice matter more than predictive justice, but it is an important and distinct side of justice, and it is the particular responsibility of those who design and deploy machine learning models. So that's the talk in a nutshell. Do check out the paper, and if you see me at FAC, then come up and say hi, or write to me. You can find me in the usual ways. All right, cheers.